So for the next unit, we're looking at Chapter 19, Section 1, Chapter 20, Section 1, 3, and 4. We're primarily looking at basically explorations from the 14, 15, 1600s by Europeans. So during this time period, we see Europe beginning to expand their territory into what we consider the Americas today, as well as actually certain parts of Asia, which would be places like India and Southeast Asia today. So let's set the stage. What is going on right now in Europe? Well, we just talked about the Reformation, the Renaissance, right? Times are changing in Europe where science is beginning to improve dramatically as various scientists emerge in the scientific revolution. But even before the scientific revolution, the Renaissance is encouraging this concept of exploration, finding new land. And Europe is finally arising out of the ashes of the Middle Ages, where they were stuck in this dark, dirty times where people went no farther than 40, 50 kilometers from where they were born. Right? These times are over. The Renaissance has come, and Europe is now traveling various places in the world. Now, this is a gross oversimplification, but it's a great way to have a general memorization of the three concepts revolving around European exploration. This is gold, God, and glory. So let's start with gold. Gold refers to Europeans wanting to find various natural resources. When it came to places like India, they knew they were looking for spices, but in fact, a lot of these resources, even the Europeans themselves, are unaware of. For example, in the Columbian Exchange, which we'll cover in more detail later on, Europeans came across new animals, new foods that would eventually transform Europe as we know it. Whether this be tomatoes or potatoes, all these were discovered through the Columbian Exchange. Secondly, glory. Another part of exploration was glory, being able to find that land and saying, hey, this is our land, we're going to name it after us. And we'll see how a lot of these explorers do go on to gain major fame once finding new land. And finally, God. What I mean by God is that Europeans want to spread Christianity. One thing to keep in mind is prior to the 1400s and the Renaissance, Europeans were also being introduced to various navigation techniques, especially from the Arab world, which helped them now have the technology to make it across the Pacific Ocean and discover these new lands. For example, the Europeans gained the astrolabe and made traveling much easier. Furthermore, they also got things from China, like the magnetic compass. So it was not France or England, but it was the small nation of Portugal who led the way of exploration and travel. And this had to do with several factors. First of all, Portugal was supporting various travel as a government. Part of the major motivation of this was that a lot of Portuguese leaders noticed that there were a lot of goods they wanted in Muslim cities in northern Africa, towards defeating and conquering cities like Ceuta, from where they would be able to discover and take things like pepper, spices, and various jewelry. Now, what else Portugal had was its geographic advantage. You can see from the map here, it's very easy for the Portuguese to go right into that northwestern part of Africa, and furthermore, later on, it helps them go westward towards what would be considered the Americas. Now, something truly remarkable about Ceuta, which was conquered by the Portuguese, is that they still conquer it and own it today. About half a century ago, Francisco Franco, a Spanish dictator, took over it, but then it went back to the Portuguese, and Portuguese still control that piece of land today, right on the northern tip there of Morocco. Now, for the longest time, what had stopped Portuguese and various European countries from getting to Asia was the terrible weather, especially in that southern tip part of Africa. And it wasn't until two key travelers, Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama, that really helped increase trade with India and Europe. So Dias's trip was both a success and a failure. Dias succeeded to get through the heavy, harsh waters of southern Africa, but by the time he got to India, he didn't have time to really settle and set up trade routes and negotiate. However, following Dias, we had Vasco da Gama. He was able to get to India, help lead the trade, and he helped set up various ports for the Portuguese to trade with India. Now, this was huge for the economy, because until then, what was happening was that Europeans were using various countries of what would be in the Middle East today. And they used those countries in the Middle East to trade the various spices they wanted from places like India. But no longer do they need this middleman if they can just go around the southern parts of Africa and go through, the Arabian Sea, this Indian Ocean, and get to India and trade on their own. Now, when it comes to the Spanish, a key traveler you have to know is Christopher Columbus. Watching the Portuguese slowly emerge in power were the Spanish, and they had their own plans. So, ironically enough, their main expedition was led by actually a guy who was rejected by the Portuguese crown, Christopher Columbus, a guy who was neither Portuguese or Spanish. In fact, he was born in what would be modern-day Italy. Upon receiving his expedition money from the Spanish crown, using what's called dead reckoning, so just the area, knowing where the sun is and using the compass, Columbus somehow makes it to what is the part of what would be considered North America. And he thought that he had arrived in Japan because he didn't realize how big the Earth actually was. So when he first got to the Asias, he would call the natives Los Indios. Now things turned quite sour very quickly between the Indians and the Spanish, as the Spanish not only gave the Indians various diseases that they had no immunity to, but they also tried to take as much gold and natural resources, which led towards a lot of battles between the two, ending up in a lot of violence. So when we look at the relationship between the Spanish and the Portuguese, we have to consider this line of demarcation. This line was set by the Pope Alexander VI in order to avoid battles between the Spanish and the Portuguese. So when we look at the line here, as you can see, it covers this the eastern part of Brazil, which is why today, when you look at Latin America, everyone speaks Spanish except one country, and yes, no surprise, that's Brazil, that speaks Portuguese. So now we have two trade empires, as you can see in the map in the bottom here, Portugal and Spain. Spain primarily in the Americas, Portugal primarily in the Asias. With the emergence of the Portuguese and the Spanish, the Europeans were no longer in need to buy spices from the middlemen, the Arabs, and therefore the Arab states begin to see a decline in their economy as they can no longer do what they used to do, which was get various items from the east, whether that be China, India, and sell them to Europe, because Europeans are now just directly going to those places. Again, this is a nice little picture that gives you an idea of just how vast the area covered by the Portuguese were. Now, the rest of the world didn't just sit there and watch. The Dutch, English, and French would go on to set up their own posts seeing the successes by the Spanish and the Portuguese. So the Spanish were the first to follow, and perhaps one of their more important voyages following Columbus was Ferdinand Magellan, who claimed the lands of what would be the Philippines today. Now this image gives you an idea of Magellan's trip. As you can see, he actually circumnavigated the entire world, although he did die part of the way through. He himself never made it all the way around, but his crew did. And when he discovered the Philippines, he named it after the Spanish king Philip II, which is why today when we look at the Philippines, a lot of aspects of the Philippines has sort of a bit of Spain in it, whether it's Roman Catholic religion, Filipino food. And it's not really a historical shout out, but when I think of Filipinos, Manny Pacquiao is probably one of the most famous Filipinos in North America, so I just threw a clip of him in here, right? Now the Dutch get involved in the 1600s and they begin to challenge the Portuguese, especially in what would be considered modern-day India, as they grow their trade empire. By the 1600s, the Dutch were able to use their strong navy and were able to push away rivals English, the Dutch, and of course the Portuguese that were already there to dominate that area. And that's when they developed what's known as the Dutch East India Company, which helped establish strong trade routes between India and the Dutch. By the 1700s, the Dutch have completely taken over what the Portuguese once controlled. Many would say this was the period of the Dutch Golden Age. They had the Dutch East India Company, which had several strongholds around the world. They had a special relationship with Japan where all the way until the 1854, when Japan remained isolated, only the Dutch, right? None of the other guys, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, they were not allowed. But the Dutch had sole trading relationships with the Japanese to the port of Nagasaki. Finally, the Dutch gave their businessmen and traders more money than other nations, and this helped motivate the average citizen to become an explorer, which, keep in mind, is not a fun job. A risky job. There's a chance you can die and you're away from your family for long hours. So by providing this incentive, they tried to get more regular people to just become explorers. And on a final quick note, the British and the French, the reason why we neglect to talk about them much here is because our focus is the 14, 15, 1600s. During this period, the British and the French do not have much going on, right? It's more in the 17, 1800s where you see the French, for example, create the French company and try to expand their territory. But again, most of Britain and France and their explorations are about the 17, 1800s. Of course, the United States of America and whatnot. So all those points, although Jamestown was in the 1600s, will be covered next year when you're in Global Studies 10. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, blah, blah, blah. Have a nice day. Goodbye.